In 1743, the distilleries of England paid duty on a little over 8 million gallons of spirit. The country had about 6 million people in it. That is a gallon of raw spirit a year for every man, woman and child in England, infants included, and it did not happen by accident. It happened because Parliament had asked for it. This is the story of the gin craze, told as a matter of money rather than morals. Why the Commons made cheap spirit deliberately and which men gained when it did. The tax that was written to be unpayable and the machine that was built in a London alley to defeat it. The two prints that everybody remembers and the statute that actually worked. And the thing that finally ended the craze, which was not a sermon and not a picture and not a magistrate. The version most people know is a moral one. A city drowning in cheap gin, a painter holding up a mirror, a government eventually finding its conscience. Every part of that is in the record somewhere. But the excise ledgers tell a different story underneath it, and the ledgers are the ones that decide when the drinking starts and when it stops. Start with the problem Parliament actually had in 1690, which was not gin, it was corn. The harvests of the late 17th century had been generous, and a generous harvest is a problem if you are the man who owns the field. Grain prices were low, rents followed grain prices down, and the House of Commons in 1690 was overwhelmingly a house of men who lived on rents. They had already dealt with one side of it. In 1689, Parliament voted a bounty on exported corn, a payment of 5 shillings a quarter to anybody shipping English wheat abroad, which is a straightforward subsidy paid by the taxpayer to hold up the price of the landowner's crop. What they wanted next was a use for the surplus at home, something that would eat grain in quantity all year round, whatever the weather. There was a second problem, and it was a war. England was fighting France, and French brandy was the drink of anybody in England who could afford it. Banning the import was easy patriotism, but it left a hole in the market and a hole in the customs revenue, and Parliament had no interest in leaving either of them open for long. The statute that opened the trade is usually called the Distilling Act, and its formal title says everything about the intention behind it. An act for the encouraging the distilling of brandy and spirits from corn, not for the regulating of it, not for the restraining of it, for the encouraging of it, and the corn is named in the title because the corn was the point. What the act did was break a monopoly. Since 1638, the Worshipful Company of Distillers had held the exclusive right to distill within 21 miles of London and had used it as trade guilds always used such rights. After 1690, anybody could distill spirits from English grain on payment of the duty, without a license, without an apprenticeship, and without the company's permission. The trade went from closed to open in a single session. The men who voted for it were not confused about what they were doing. They were creating an industrial customer for their own product. A distillery does not care whether the barley it buys is fit for bread. It will take the poor grain, the wet grain, the tail end of a bad crop, which is exactly the grain that has no other buyer. That is a price floor delivered as a manufacturing industry. And here is the question this whole story comes down to, so put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. Parliament did not set out to flood London with gin. It set out to hold up the price of grain, and the gin was the mechanism it chose. So when the mechanism worked exactly as designed, was what followed? A policy failure, or was it the bill for a policy that succeeded? See whether you still think the same thing by the end. At the start of the 1690s, the English stills charged duty on under 500,000 gallons a year. Within 20 years, that had roughly quadrupled. By 1735, the same ledgers were recording something over 6 million gallons. And the true number was higher because the ledgers only ever counted what came forward for duty and a great deal did not. The tax system pushed in the same direction, and this is the part that gets missed. Beer was the traditional drink of the English poor, and beer was taxed heavily at the malt and again at the barrel because beer was reliable revenue and had been for a century. Spirits were the new trade, and the new trade was taxed lightly to encourage it. 2 pence on a gallon of low wines against a beer duty the brewers complained about in every session. Put those two decisions together and you have the whole engine. Cheap spirit, dear beer, no license required to sell, and a parliament with an interest in the volume going up. By the 1702s, a labouring man in London could buy more alcohol for a penny in gin than he could buy for 6pence in beer. Nobody in the Commons had voted for a drunk city. They had voted twice for a high corn price. So much for the policy. Here is what it looked like at street level, because the street is where the numbers turn into a phrase everybody has heard. A dram of gin in the 730s cost a penny. A labourer in London earned somewhere between a shilling and 18 pence for a day's work, so a day's wages bought a dozen drams and left change. Gin was not merely cheap relative to brandy. It was the cheapest way to be warm, the cheapest way to stop being hungry for an hour, and it was sold within a few doors of wherever you lived. Hogarth painted the sign onto the wall of the cellar in the bottom left corner of the print, and it is the most quoted piece of advertising in English history. Drunk for a penny, dead. Drunk for 2 pence, clean straw for nothing. 3 prices, in ascending order, for a service the trade understood perfectly well it was providing. William Hogarth had been born in the parish next to the one he drew, and had watched his own father fail in business and be locked up for debt within a mile of that cellar. Gin Lane is not a tourist view of St. Giles. It is our locals, and the local knew what rent was charged in those houses and what the pawnbroker on the corner paid for a coat. The selling was not confined to shops. Gin went out of chandlers' shops and barbers' shops, off wheelbarrows, out of the back rooms of weavers' houses, and, in one famous instance recorded by the justices, from a stall inside a prison. There was no license to lose, so there was no barrier to entry. Anyone with a few shillings could buy a small cask and become a retailer for the week. By the middle of the 1730s, the Middlesex magistrates were reporting that in some parishes of the metropolis, roughly 1 house in 4 sold spirits. That figure is a magistrate's estimate rather than a census, and it comes from men who wanted the trade curbed. But, even discounted, it describes something without a modern parallel in a city of about 600,000 people. There is a colder measure than a magistrate's estimate, and it sits in the parish registers. Through most of the 1720s, 1730s, and 1740s, London buried more people than it christened, and the capital only grew at all because the country kept sending it more. Corbin Morris, a customs official with a taste for statistics, went through the bills of mortality in 1751 and laid the gap out year by year, and he put a large part of it down to spirits. Contemporaries were arguing about the causes then, and historians argue about them now, but nobody disputes the shape of the figures. The man who had to balance the books through the worst of it was Sir Robert Walpole, First Lord of the Treasury for 21 years, and the closest thing the age had to a permanent Chancellor. Walpole had already learned what happened when a minister went after excise revenue in the wrong way. His attempt to reform the tobacco and wine duties in 1733 nearly brought his government down. That is the pressure that shaped every gin law for the next 20 years. The spirit duty was real money, growing money, and it arrived without any of the collection costs of a land tax. A minister could deplore the gin shops in the morning and count their contribution in the afternoon, and the same men who signed the magistrates' petitions owned the fields the grain came from. There had already been one attempt. An Act of 1729 put a duty of 5 shillings on the gallon and required a retailer to hold a £20 license, which was a serious sum. It had the effect that such laws usually have. The legal trade contracted, an illegal compound sold under the name of parliamentary brandy took its place, and the revenue fell. In 1733, the whole thing was repealed, and the distillers and the corn growers had won the argument again. Which brings us to the most famous piece of tax legislation nobody has ever heard of, and the point at which the Commons stopped pretending it was regulating a trade and started trying to abolish one. The Act carried the name of Sir Joseph Jekyll, the Master of the Rolls, a lawyer of unquestioned seriousness who had spent years pressing for it. His Act of 1736 did not ban the sale of gin because a ban would have been unenforceable and would have said out loud that Parliament was destroying an industry it had built. It taxed it instead at a level chosen so that nobody could pay. A retailer would now need a license costing £50 a year. £50 was more than a year's income for most of the households in the parishes concerned, and it was demanded of a shopkeeper whose entire stock might be worth £5. On top of the license came a duty of 20 shillings on every gallon sold, which was several times the value of the spirit itself. Enforcement was the interesting part, because there was no police force to enforce anything. So, the Act built its own. Any person who informed against an unlicensed seller was to be paid out of the resulting fine, and the informer was to be paid £5 out of the fine, which was 3 months of a labourer's wages for one afternoon's work. Parliament had outsourced the policing to whoever wanted the money. In the whole of the first year, 2 of those licenses were taken out in London. Not 200, 2! The trade did not pay the tax, apply for the license, or close. It simply carried on and dared the informers to come. They came. The courts filled with prosecutions, and so did the prisons, and the informers found out what their £5 was actually worth. Crowds hunted them through the streets. Some were beaten, a few were killed, and the magistrates who were meant to be running the system began to find reasons not to convict. On the day the Act came into force, there were mock funerals for Madame Geneva, with black crape and processions, which is not the behaviour of a population that has been successfully prohibited. The neatest answer belonged to an Irish adventurer named Dudley Bradstreet, who had worked as a government informer himself, and therefore understood exactly what an informer needed in order to be paid. He needed to identify a seller. Bradstreet's idea was to make sure there was never a seller to identify. Bradstreet laid out £13 on gin and rented a room in an alley, taking a lease in another man's name. He nailed the carved sign of a cat to the window, put word about that gin could be had there, and cut a slot beneath the cat's paw with a lead pipe running from it into the room. A customer put a coin in the slot and said quietly, "Puss." A voice inside said, "Mew!" The coin went in, and the gin came down the pipe, and no human being was ever seen to sell anything to anybody. It worked, and it was copied across London within months because the design defeated the mechanism rather than the law. The act needed a witness who could name a retailer. The pipe made the retailer invisible and the transaction unwitnessed, and the £5 reward is worth nothing to a man who cannot swear who took his penny. Now for the number that settles the argument about that act. Charged production rose through the entire period of the crackdown. The peak of 8 million gallons falls in 1743, the peak year of the whole episode, and it fell in the middle of the crackdown, 7 years after Parliament had made the retail trade legally impossible. The unenforceable tax raised almost nothing, and consumption climbed to its highest recorded level while it was in force. One thing before we go on, if you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a new piece of British financial history every single day. In 1743, Parliament gave up and reversed itself completely. The licence fell from £50 to 20 shillings, the crushing per gallon duty went, and a moderate duty was put on the distiller instead, where it could actually be collected. Retail sale was tied to licensed alehouses, which were premises with a name over the door and something to lose. It was a straightforward admission that a tax you can collect at a low rate is worth more than a tax you cannot collect at a high one, and the revenue came back at once. What finally moved the number was not a sermon and not a print, though 1751 produced the best-remembered examples of both. It was the price of wheat and the return of the argument to where it had started 60 years earlier. The magistrate for Westminster at the time was Henry Fielding, better known now for his novels, who spent the last years of his life running a court in Bow Street and trying to build something like a police force out of nothing. He saw the trade from the bench, which is a different view from the pulpit, and he wrote about its economics rather than its sinfulness. Fielding put a figure on it in a pamphlet published that January. Gin is the principal sustenance, if it may be so called, of more than 100,000 people in this metropolis. Sustenance is the word to notice. He is not describing a vice. He is describing a substitute for food in a city where the poorest people could not afford enough of it. The prints came the following month. William Hogarth issued Beer Street and Gin Lane in February 1751, deliberately priced at a shilling apiece so that the people in them could afford to buy them, and timed to the bill then going through the Commons. Gin Lane is the most effective piece of political advertising in the English 18th century, and it was published as advertising in support of a specific statute at a specific moment. Beer Street is the other half of that argument, and it is an economic one rather than a moral one. The tradesmen in it are working, the buildings are being repaired, and the only failing business on the street is the pawnbrokers. Beer was brewed from English barley by licensed brewers who paid duty on every barrel and could be found when the exciseman called. The picture is an argument about which trade a government should want. That statute is the Sale of Spirits Act of 1751, usually called the Tippling Act, and it succeeded because it was written by people who had watched 1736 fail. It did not try to price the trade out of existence. It cut off the routes by which the trade reached the poorest customers one at a time and left the licensed trade intact. Distillers were forbidden to retail. Shopkeepers, chandlers, and prison keepers were forbidden to sell spirits at all. A license would be granted only to a house paying at least £10 a year in rent, which took the trade out of the cellars and the back rooms and put it in premises with a landlord and a rateable value. The clause that did the quiet work is the one about debt. No debt contracted for spirituous liquors under the value of 20 shillings shall be recoverable in any court of law. Read that again as a shopkeeper. Every small slate, every drink advanced against Friday's wages became legally uncollectible, and the credit that the street trade actually ran on simply stopped being worth extending. Even so, the Act on its own would not have done it. The harvests of 1757, 1758, and 1759 came in badly. Wheat prices rose sharply, and there were food riots in a dozen counties. In 1757, the government prohibited the distilling of spirits from grain outright and renewed the prohibition year by year until 1760. Look at what that prohibition was for. It was not passed to sober anybody up. It was passed because grain had become too valuable to burn, and the same landed interest that had wanted a distillery in every county when corn was cheap wanted the stills shut the moment corn was dear. Charged production came down to about 2 million gallons, and it stayed down. Set the two policies side by side, and the shape of the thing is plain. The same building that made gin cheap to help the corn price made gin dear when the corn price rose. In both cases, the deciding number was the value of a quarter of wheat, and in both cases, the decision was taken by men who owned the wheat. So the arc of it runs like this: 500,000 gallons in 1690, when Parliament opened the trade to support the price of grain. 6 million by 735. 8 million at the peak in 743, in the middle of the most severe prohibition ever attempted. 2 million by the end of the 1750s, when grain became too expensive to distill. 60 years, 4 major statutes, and the only 2 moments the line moves hard are the moments the price of corn moved. It is worth being precise about who paid, because the accounting is not complicated. The landowner got a buyer for his worst grain in the years when nobody else wanted it. The treasury got a growing excise. It did not have to collect house by house. The distiller got an open trade. And the cost was carried in full by the poorest streets of London, which had no representation in the House that voted for any of it. That is not a lesson about gin. It is the standard shape of a policy that creates a market and then tries to tax the consequences. The market is made in one act with a title about encouragement, and the consequences arrive 20 years later in front of magistrates who had nothing to do with the original decision and no instrument capable of undoing it. Which returns us to the question. Parliament in 1690 wanted a higher corn price and got one. It also got a city where a quarter of the houses in some parishes sold spirits, and where a working man could drink a day's wages for a penny at a time. Those are not two separate events. They are the intended result and the unintended result of the same vote, and both are in the same ledgers. The record does not support the comfortable version, in which a wicked trade grew up and a decent parliament eventually put it down. Parliament built the trade on purpose, protected it in 1733 when the money was good, failed to suppress it in 1736 when the mood turned, and only broke it in the 1750s by a combination of a well-drafted statute and a run of bad harvests that made the raw material too dear to waste. Madame Geneva was buried in effigy in 1736 and outlived her funeral by 20 years. What killed her in the end was not the sermon or the print or the informer with his £5. It was the price of bread.